Please join me in welcoming tonight's guests. Give it up for Sasha-Ann Simons and Dr. Fauci. How you doing?
Good. Good to be here. Thank you for having me.
New York Times bestseller, #1.
Yeah.
Amazing. How does that feel?
Well, I just heard about it, so I'm just just trying to process it.
Just now? You just got the news?
It feels good. It feels good, yeah.
Yeah. So I want to dive into this book. In your 4th year at Cornell Medical School, you write about how nothing could have prepared you for a visit that you got from your mother. When you learned at the time that she had been feeling sick, you got her checked out by a doctor that you were training under, and eventually she was diagnosed with cancer. She died, unfortunately, 8 weeks later,
Right.
and was buried, and you had to be back on call on the wards the very next night.
Right.
You say in the book, I stuffed my painful feelings down deep and put my energy into saving the lives that were possible to be saved. Was that the moment where you saw the reality of the job that you had signed up for? That even in the face of your own mother's death,
Yeah.
you had to serve the public?
Well, yeah, that was one of the most important things, because my identity up to that point with my mother was as a son to the mother. Mm-hmm. And I was in my surgery rotation, and I had a bunch of mentors in medicine and in surgery. And when my mother came to me and told me what her symptoms were, which was she was feeling very fatigued and bloated, and she was losing weight, and all of a sudden, the doctor, the emerging doctor in me, knew immediately, because that's what I had been studying, that this was a bad, bad sign. And I had that dual identity as a physician and as a son at the same time. And that really, got me feeling strongly about when you said after she passed, it gave me even more energy to suppress my feeling of grief, because I couldn't grieve, because the next day I was in the operating room, as a student learning the fundamentals of medicine. Right. So it allowed me for the first time, and that became very, very important during the very difficult years of HIV, to suppress the feelings of the loss of your mother and the loss of your patients, and just do your job. So that was my first introduction into suppressing personal feelings and just doing your job.
And we're going to talk more about that, because over time, you have advised 7 U.S. presidents. You've spent nearly 4 decades as the nation's top infectious disease expert, nearly 60 years in public health. I would say that there have probably been several points in your life, Dr. Fauci, where you could have written a memoir. So what's up? Why is now the time? Hey.
Well, I was kind of busy.
Why isn't this part 2? Good answer. Good answer. But in all seriousness, why is now the time for this? Right? Because everything happens when it's supposed to happen.
Yeah, well, there are 2 major reasons, Sasha, that I did it. As you said, I had been at the NIH for 54 years, more than half a century, and was the director of the Institute for almost 40 years. And I reached a certain point in my career, after all of the things that I've done, that I thought, what now at my age can I do to even further, while I still have energy, while I'm fortunately still healthy, and I still have the passion to serve, what can I do now that's a bit different than what I had been doing for the previous period of time? And there were 2 things. I said, I had the very unusual experience, because no one at this point, at least that I know even in history, because of the longevity of my tenure, had the opportunity to be in the position I was in for half a century, more than half a century, and have the opportunity to experience in the bookends of my career, because in the very early years were the very early years of HIV, and in the December of my career was the most horrendous pandemic that we've had in 100 years. So I felt I had the unique position of having been someone who lived through all of those things, HIV, Ebola, Zika, pandemic flu, the anthrax attacks. So I thought it would be historically, not as a historical scholar, because I didn't go into all of the different details, but what one person's experience was, and you have the same person experiencing multiple things. So I thought that would be historically of interest to some. But equally as important is I felt it would be, hopefully, a source of inspiration for either people already in public health and public service, or more importantly, for younger people who are considering a career in public health and public service, to perhaps inspire them that this is a challenging but a very rewarding field.
Right. You take us on the journey, right? As it says in the title.
Right.
Your journey. And you have, I think, probably the sharpest memory of anyone I've ever met. This book, y'all, I mean, you introduce us to the Brooklyn boy, right? This is before Dr. Fauci. You recall days of your mother pushing you in your stroller?
Yeah. No.
I read that and I thought,
I'm not that
how
good.
does he remember this?
No, when you're a child, and I found this from my rotation, I'm not a pediatrician, but there are certain images that you remember
Yes.
from a very, very early age. And one of the things I do remember, and I saw a picture of it, and this one of the pictures I believe is in the book.
It is.
Of little Tony Fauci in the Bensonhurst section of Brooklyn.
That's right.
And during that time, I am 83 years old, and that means it was the 1940s. So in the 1940s, my mother used to go shopping, from store to store, to the butcher shop, the vegetable shop, et cetera. And she would push me along in the stroller. And the thing that I remember was the bright sun in my face as she was pushing along. And as you can see from the photo that I picked from my family pictures, was little Anthony in the stroller.
Oh, you were tiny, and
I'm still tiny.
You talk about how the warmth and the sunlight on your face and your mother's presence, how it made you feel a sense of security.
Right.
Let's fast forward to now. These days, you're traveling with security to go from point A to point B.
Right.
How does that feel? It's very different.
It's a very different feeling, but it's a reflection of what has emerged in our country over the last several years, is a profound degree of divisiveness in society that just is not good. As I describe in the going through the 7 presidents, is that the political ideological differences, in my mind, when they remain differences, are healthy because it's a diversity of opinion. You could be center, center-right, mid-right, far-right, center, center-left, mid-left, progressive. As long as that's done in a civil way, that's the beauty of our country, because it's a democracy that allows for multiple thoughts and multiple expressions of ideology. What's happened in a way that's so disturbing is the profound degree of divisiveness, where differences are looked upon as, I hate you for your difference. And then hate turns into vitriol ad hominem, and then you have threats against public officials, threats against doctors and nurses for being involved in trying to save people's lives.
Did you ever think you'd see something like this?
No, I didn't, because, I'm not a political person, and anybody who knows me knows that I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm a physician and a scientist. And because of the difficulties that occurred during the Trump administration, people incorrectly assumed that I was of a political persuasion, and I'm not. I did some of the most important things that I've done in my professional career with George W. Bush when we did the PEPFAR program. And one of the most warm relationships I've had was as warm a relationship with George H.W. Bush as I had with Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. So it has nothing to do with political ideology. It has to do with the divisiveness that I think is tearing our country apart, which is very unfortunate.
Now, you've testified before Congress many, many, many times.
Hundreds.
Hundreds of times. But this most recent time, this was a little different.
Yeah.
It got particularly heated. I want to know what it was like from where you sat,
Yeah.
because we know what we saw.
Yeah, well, it got heated on the other side. I stayed cool. No, what it was a bit of a circus.
That's a good word.
Of a reflection of what I just said, Sasha, of the divisiveness. So the purpose of the hearing a few weeks ago, the proposed purpose of the hearing was to try and examine what you always do when you go through a very difficult situation like the pandemic, is to think about lessons learned. What can we do better? How can we prepare for doing it better next time? How can we learn from the things we really did well? And how can we learn from the things that we could have done better? And how do we prepare to do them better? Anybody who tuned in on that hearing, that was not what was going on in that hearing. It was pure vitriol, pure ad hominem, pure attacks, and that got nowhere. So in my mind, there was no value added to that process when it could have been something that was helpful for the next time.
Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene said that you should be prosecuted, you belong in prison. I have to ask, but for you though, I love that I have a little soundtrack here to go along. We rehearsed this, I promise. But the reason I bring her up is because I wonder what that then does to the person, right? To Anthony Fauci. Are you then living in some sort of fear? Are these moments connected to some of the death threats and things that you've been receiving?
No, I certainly.
What about your family?
Yeah, well, I certainly am not afraid of Marjorie Taylor Greene. That's. But what it does, which is disturbing, is that when she goes on a rant like that and makes those absolutely outlandish statements, it does trigger in some who, I don't want to cast any dispersions on them, who actually take that thing seriously. And that's when you get the death threats, and that's when you get the harassment of your wife and the harassment of your children, because a public figure gets up there and says something like that. And there may be 99 people who say, what a moron that person is. And there's one person might say, well, maybe I'm going to do something about that. And that's how you get the threats. Mm-hmm. Right?
One thing I'll be doing tonight is weaving in some audience questions. Beforehand, we received some questions from folks who are here tonight to see you. So I'll be weaving those into the questions that I have for you. So on that note, knowing all that you know about the science, being a physician for all these years, having so many decades of experience, and then now having people look at you as if you're some guy who doesn't know what he's talking about, or that you're making things up.
Yeah.
Audience member Kitty Hopper asks, how do you handle such disrespect?
Well, you don't get involved in it, and that's the reason why when Marjorie Taylor Greene was attacking me, I didn't want to lower myself to, responding to that. So when people do that, it just reinforces in me to focus on what my job is, and that's the thing I learned as a physician taking care of desperately ill patients. If your job is to save the life of a desperately ill person, you screen out everything else. You screen out fatigue, you screen out where you think you're going to be tomorrow. All of that stuff has got to be out of your mind. When you're a public health official, your patient is the United States of America, and you really feel an obligation to focus everything you do to preserve and protect the health of the people of the United States, which, by the way, since the United States has such an important influence globally, indirectly, you're doing it for the rest of the world. So
Right.
when people attack you like that, it's noise. It's not, it's noise. They could say whatever they do, and they act in a very theatrical way to gain attention, to raise money for their political. I think that's terrible that they do that, but I'm not going to get involved in making that influence me, or certainly not intimidate me. Right?
So we are sitting here today, and we still don't know the origin of COVID-19.
Correct.
Americans we were given, especially in the beginning, all kinds of guidance from early on, how to navigate sort of trying to keep ourselves and each other safe and alive. There was a closed-door meeting that you took part in January. You reportedly said that the guidance to stay 6 feet apart to reduce the spread of the virus was, quote, it sort of just appeared.
Right.
That remark, as you know, angered some Republican leaders. Can you clear that up?
Sure.
What exactly did you mean when you say that?
Well, see, I was in what a transcribed interview is, that they put you in a room for 7 hours in a row and ask you questions one after the other after the other. If you get up to go to the bathroom, the clock stops. And then you come back and you do it so 7 hours equals 8 hours. So during that period of time, the question was asked about the 6 feet rule, which gets completely taken out of context when they go outside and report it to the reporters. First of all, that is a CDC rule. That is not an Anthony Fauci rule.
You didn't make that up.
Okay.
We heard it here tonight.
Okay. There's no way I made that up. Okay. But I'm not throwing the CDC under the bus. I'm going to explain why they said 6 feet. Up to that time, the way that respiratory illnesses were essentially addressed was that it was the influenza model, when it was felt that if you sneeze or cough, droplets come out, which is, you're in a subway or you're walking on the street, when people sneeze, you could almost see those little droplets. It was felt that those droplets, because they're heavy, they generally fall down somewhere between 3 and 6 feet. So the understandable, but what turned out to be ultimately incorrect, is that the CDC said there should be 6 feet of space, so that when people are infected and are having a respiratory illness. The trouble is, they didn't know until later on that COVID, or SARS-CoV-2, is spread mostly by aerosol, which means that these particles hang around for a long period of time and go well beyond 6 feet. But importantly, 50 to 60% of all the transmissions with COVID have been from someone who has no symptoms at all. So that's the reason why there have been reports of people who go into a choir, none of them are sick, and they're singing together like on a stage, and 12 out of the 18 people get infected. And that's because, A, you don't have to be symptomatic, and B, it's much more aerosol. So when I said it just appeared, what I meant, and I was very clear about it, even though it was cherry-picked, was that what the CDC was doing, they were relying on a model that was applicable to other diseases, but turned out to be not applicable. The truth be told, when you really started to study aerosol, that rule is probably not particularly applicable even to flu, but we didn't know that at the time. So the CDC was acting in good faith for what they knew about other respiratory diseases. That got twisted and distorted. Those scientists don't have any idea what they're talking about. That's really not what the situation was. Right.
Thank you for clearing that up. So on to vaccines. We still don't have an effective HIV vaccine, and we'll circle back to that. We do have one for COVID.
Right.
it came together in just 11 months,
Right.
which was even to your surprise.
Indeed.
Indeed, yeah, and the distribution went rather speedy as well, Doctor. So how did it get done so quickly?
Great question, and this is really important for people to understand. It is really a testimony to the importance of the investment over decades in basic and clinical biomedical research, and how you can be researching. How you could be researching in one area and unwittingly know that it will benefit another area. And I'll go quickly in it because it's a great story, and I want to just get the fundamentals of it. So there was an investment in how you can make mRNA be a vaccine because it's a very adaptable molecule. You could stick whatever it is you want, and you could change it however you want. Those researchers were working on that for about 15 or more years before we actually had the need for it with COVID. One of those researchers actually was a fellow of mine for 6 or 7 years, Drew Weissman, and he happened to win the Nobel Prize for it. Okay, so that was pretty good.
That's awesome.
He was a smart guy, very smart guy. On the other hand, a number of researchers were trying to use structure-based vaccine design to develop the correct molecule for an HIV vaccine. They were unsuccessful with that, but what they learned was how to get molecules in the right conformation to be the best business end of a vaccine. So when COVID became known and SARS was sequenced, I told my team that we're going to need to make a vaccine. That's our job, to make a vaccine. So the chief vaccine person in my group, who I mentioned in the book, Barney Graham, told me, get me the sequence of this particular virus, and I will put the proper sequence into the mRNA, and we'll start making a vaccine within days. That's unheard of. It usually takes years to do that, but they were perched for it. And then what we did is we went and did a phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, and the federal government, to the credit of the Trump administration, invested billions of dollars to essentially pre-purchase the vaccine before you knew it even worked, so that if it doesn't work, you lose billions of dollars. You know who loses it? The federal government. The companies would never, ever have done that unless they had a guarantee that even if it didn't work. Fortunately, because of the incredible eloquence of the science, we did phase 1, 2, 3 trials in 11 months. Normally, that would take about 7 years.
Right.
But it wasn't rushed in the sense of compromising anything. It was just done in a way that we made major investments to de-risk. And the bottom line, as we all know, is that 11 months after we started, we had a vaccine that was tested in tens of thousands of people. It wasn't just a few people.
Pfizer.
Tens of thousands. Pfizer, Moderna, J&J, tens of thousands of people. And after 11 months, we had a vaccine that was going into the arms of individuals that was safe and effective to the tune of 93 to 94%, which we know
That's
now.
also unheard of.
Unprecedented.
Yes.
The average in a good year would be, 7 to 10 years to get it. But the thing that people didn't fully appreciate is that influenza vaccines on a good year, a good vaccine year, is maybe 50% effective. On a bad year, it can be as low as 10 to 20% effective. This vaccine was 93% effective. And that's why in the preface to the book, when they called me up and I was, eating...
Oh, you nearly lost your mind.
No,
you got emotional.
I actually broke into tears because I was hoping it would work, but I really didn't think it was going to be 90%.
But that speedy process, can you see why some have been skeptic?
Of course. Yeah, of course. I mean, you could understand when people are skeptical about it, but there are some people who fundamentally just don't believe in vaccine. And
Right.
that is unfortunate because when you could have differences of opinion. You know, there were a number of people, but the former Senator Daniel Moynihan was the one that first told me that. You're entitled to your own set of opinion, but you're not entitled to your own set of data, okay? So
I like that.
the data are incontrovertible. If you look at people who are unvaccinated, the hospitalization and death rate was like this. People who were vaccinated and boosted, the death rate and the hospitalization rate was like this. No vaccine is 100% safe. There are adverse effects, but they're exceedingly rare. What people didn't appreciate is that in the Commonwealth Fund did a study, you know, just unbiased study that showed between November, December 2020 and February of 2022, in the United States, vaccination for COVID saved 3 million lives, 18 million hospitalization, and saved $1.1 trillion. In the European Union, did the same study, and it saved 14 million lives. And yet, we're still having this divisive arguments now that vaccines don't work, and in fact, they're more harmful than they are helpful, which, you know, you can believe that if you want, as Senator Moynihan said, but you can't make up your own data. That's the point.
Another audience question. Ann Schultz says, who's also a physician, asks, what do you feel was your biggest mistake in combating the widespread disinformation during that time? And how do you propose rebuilding the public trust in the expert institutions like the CDC, like the NIH, that we so desperately need to shepherd us through the next pandemic?
You know, I don't know if, first of all, we didn't do everything perfectly. So I will be the first to admit with humility that we could have done things better because we were dealing with an emerging catastrophic situation that at the worst point was killing 3,000 to 4,000 to 5,000 people per day. You know, there were freezer trucks in front of the hospitals in New York City because we couldn't fit all the bodies in the morgue. So this was not your usual situation. And
So
when you've
what would you have changed? Would you have changed the
No, what I'm
lockdown?
saying is that we made decisions that were not perfect decisions. So I don't know if you want to call them mistakes. We acted on the best information that we had. But if you go back retrospectively and say, what you may have done a little bit differently to counter the misinformation and disinformation, I'm not sure I have an answer to you because misinformation and disinformation, conspiracy theories were exploding during the time of COVID. So I'm trying to think, because it's not an unreasonable question, what could I have done, or not only me, I mean, I was the very public person that was on TV every night. So there was this interesting but completely incorrect assumption that I made all of the policy decisions, you know, which is the reason why I'm the biggest target.
You mean you didn't?
No, I didn't. We had a team.
Team Shmee, kidding.
Yeah.
Okay. Several Asian and European countries, I'm thinking of Canada as well, even some South American countries, they pushed well past the US when it came to vaccination rates.
Right.
Did you ever look to other countries and think, I mean, have they done something that we just haven't been able to do yet?
Yeah, they didn't have the degree of divisiveness in their country that we have. That is absolutely the case. And I was on the phone weekends, nights, middle of the night, because we were talking to Australia and South Africa and Israel and the UK. We have a situation in our own country. We were hoping to get, you know, 80% of the 90% of the population. You know, we got to about 62 and never got really beyond that, 62% of the people, because of what was much more prevalent here. And in some respects, it's the bad news part of the American feeling of independence. You know, don't tell me what to do. I mean, that's part of our tradition. That's not the way it is in a number of countries. They believe the officials say, listen, we have a vaccine, we really got to take a vaccine. There was a lot of pushback on the part of vaccine. The thing that was painful for someone like me, who's not a political person, is that because there was more of an anti-vax among people who were Republicans, the Trump Republicans versus Democrats, the numbers, and this isn't made up, it's just a fact, and you can't run away from the fact. If you lived in a red state or a red region or a red city versus a blue state or a blue region or a blue city, the chances of you dying or being hospitalized with COVID were far greater in that red state, region, city than a blue state, because the vaccination rate among Republicans was much lower than the vaccination rate among Democrats. Now, being someone who's neither of that, it's so painful to me that someone would actually risk their lives, their hospitalization, and the health of their family purely based on ideological considerations. It just doesn't make any sense.
Oh,
That's
but it
the
happened.
scary. It happened.
It happened.
Yeah.
You give readers insight into some tense moments and phone calls between you and Donald Trump, right? Especially in your chapter, it's titled, "He Loves Me, He Loves Me Not." How perfect is that? Reading through Dr. Fauci, it feels like behind the scenes it was almost as chaotic as it was to us, sort of watching from afar. But I wonder if
It wasn't as scary, though.
It wasn't as scary? But do you think today that Donald Trump respects you? And is that even important?
No, it's not important, and I don't want to get into his head. It's not important. But it was a complicated relationship, and the thing that I try to clear up the record for those who've attacked me because they thought I was undermining, I had no antipathy to President Trump at all, not at all.
You mean when you corrected him on the...
No, when I corrected him, it was very painful for me to do that, and let me explain. Because in the first few months, he and I developed quite a good rapport. And I describe it in the book. I don't know what it was, but it was kind of like two guys from New York City. He's from the Queens, I'm from Bensonhurst in Brooklyn. It's kind of that New York.
You said y'all had the same swagger.
The same New York swagger. So we got along pretty well. In the first few months, when we were making the Debbie Birx and I and the task force made the recommendation to essentially flatten the curve because our hospitals were being overrun. It was the right thing to do. He went along with it, in credit to him, because he was hoping that the outbreak would peak the way influenza peaks, and then in March and April it would go away, because he just clung to this is like flu. And as I mentioned several times in the book, I had to explain to Mr. President, this is not influenza. It's much, much different.
Right.
So what he did then, when he saw it wasn't going to go away, he started saying, well, it's going to disappear like magic. And then when it didn't disappear like magic, he invoked some unscientific things like it could be hydroxychloroquine, because somebody on Fox News said that hydroxychloroquine works. It was at that point that I had to make a decision, which was very painful, because I have a great deal of respect for the presidency of the United States. I have served 7 presidents. So when I had to, when the reporters asked me up there in front of the screen, is it going to disappear like magic? And I had to say, no, it's not. And does hydroxychloroquine work? No, not only does it not work, but it actually can harm you. Interestingly, he was not as upset at that as his staff, who were furious with me and then started to undermine everything I was trying to do. So it wasn't until well into the year, as we got to the election, that he started to get really angry. But he went for a significant period of time understanding what I was doing, but just essentially not paying attention to it. It's much distorted from what people were saying. They thought I was trying to deliberately undermine him, and I absolutely would never have done that. I just, in order to preserve my own professional integrity and to fulfill my responsibility to who I'm responsible for, which is the American public, not an administration.
You did what you had to do.
Yeah.
You did what you had to do. Yeah. And this book is about a lot more than just COVID-19
Yeah.
and President Trump.
Yeah.
You take us on a journey from the AIDS era through diseases like anthrax and smallpox, influenza, Zika. You write in very vivid detail about working to build an AIDS research program and about some of the very first patients that you had. I'm curious what sticks out to you most from that era, because there was a lot.
Well, it is, about 40% of the book, I think, or more, is on my experience with HIV, because I'm a physician, I'm a scientist, and my expertise is HIV/AIDS. I'm an infectious disease person, and I was one of the very first people to treat persons with this unusual disease. My entire career, Sasha, turned around with HIV because I had been a quite successful physician developing therapeutic regimens for unusual inflammatory diseases called inflammation of the vessels, in which it's high degree of mortality, but 100% practically, and we developed therapy. So I was doing really well for 7, 8, 9 years of feeling very good. Patients who thought they were going to die would come to me. I developed protocols, saved their lives, and I wrote about it, and people throughout the country and the world were using those protocols. When the first cases of which turned out to be HIV were described in a report from the CDC, curiously, like first 5 and then 26, all previously healthy young gay men with this strange disease without a name, certainly without an etiology, and they were all dying within 10 to 15 months. So I made a decision that I was going to turn the direction of my career around and start figuring out what this disease is and how we can help these men who were suffering terribly and dying and frightened by this disease.
Yeah.
So from 1981 until we developed very effective drugs, 1996, 97, I personally took care of hundreds and hundreds of desperately ill, young, mostly gay men, some injection drug users. And I refer to them in the book as the dark years of my professional career, if not my life, because I went from being on a high of essentially saving people's lives and having them be so grateful to me, to having all of my patients, who you develop strong relationships with, dying, almost every single one of them. And I describe in the book that I, like many of my colleagues, really developed a form of post-traumatic stress syndrome, because in order to take care of a patient and give them the care they deserve, you can't get emotional about it. You can't say, oh my God, another patient dying. You've got to suppress it and give them the best possible care you can give them. When you suppress pain and grief that much, it comes out 20 years later.
So what does it look like today?
Well, today, I've gotten used to it because I flash back, and I think that was one of the cathartic things about writing the book, where I describe, one patient in particular that we got very close to, that when that patient really deteriorated, it was very, very difficult. I'm past that now, but there were periods of times where you would just get flashbacks of dark years.
What sticks out to me as I hear you say this is a moment in the book. This is, I think we were in the anthrax section of your book, and you, of course, are talking about the lost sleep, right? That comes up quite a bit. You didn't sleep. You didn't sleep for 60 years.
A few hours, but not.
Here and there.
Yeah.
You talked about one late night when you were leaving, I think it was like 2:30 in the morning, and you were leaving work, you were walking to your car, and you broke into tears on the way to your car. Do you remember the feeling that came over you?
Yeah, I think it was during the times, some of you probably don't remember, good thing that you don't, is that we actually really thought when the anthrax letters came, it was 1 month after the attack by Al-Qaeda on 9/11 in New York and in Washington, D.C., and in Philadelphia, we were convinced that Al-Qaeda was planning a smallpox or botulism attack because of these letters that came in the mail to a couple of senators, Senator Daschle, Senator Leahy, as well as the news organization. The tension was such of trying to build up a biodefense because we were almost positive that there was going to be a bioterror attack.
You were in a constant state of anxiety.
I was totally adrenalized. I mean, I just couldn't sleep. I would go to bed and look at the ceiling, get up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was at the White House, and then I had to go back to my day job at the NIH. And it was about 2:30 in the morning, and I was completely exhausted. And I think it was more breaking out in tears of exhaustion, because when you reach a certain level of exhaustion, you can't sleep. It's almost like paradoxical. You're so exhausted and you're so anxious that you can't sleep. So that was good that I broke down, because then I went home and went to sleep.
Not before mentioning how embarrassed you would have been had any of your coworkers caught you crying.
Yeah, at 3 o'clock in the morning in the parking lot, I would have been institutionalized.
So that was 2001. Now, in August 2014, the first couple of cases of Ebola virus made their way to the U.S. And in the months following, you watched the country's response to that increasing number of cases over in West Africa. You say go, quote, a bit over the edge, right? The response did. There were calls to close the borders and not allow anyone to enter or leave the 3 West African countries. You completely disagreed with that approach,
Yes.
and you did not want for us to cut off those countries from
Correct.
the outside world. Why? Why'd you stand your ground with that?
Well, I stood my ground with that because Ebola, unlike respiratory-borne illnesses like COVID, cannot be transmitted from one person to another unless you come into direct contact with the bodily fluids of a desperately ill patient. The modality of transmission of Ebola is not respiratory, it's not casual, it's completely opposite of COVID, which you can just talk to someone or sing or raise your voice and you could spread it. And there was this fear because back during, and this is 2014, 2015, when Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia had 28,000 cases and 18,000 deaths. And in the front page of the New York Times and in the Washington Post, they would show you these dead bodies in the streets of Conakry, of Monrovia, et cetera. So the people in the United States thought, oh my God, we can't have Ebola come to the United States. So when we had that one patient who slipped through because he said that he had not been exposed, 2 nurses got infected. They thought that the whole country was going to get infected, which was, you know, I say in the book, it was an epidemic of fear as opposed to an epidemic of Ebola. And the point I was trying to make is that the people that were really suffering were the Africans in Africa, not people in the United States. And that was interesting because then people started to attack me for being more concerned about Africa when I wasn't, because it could not have happened here.
Oh, you've just been...
Yeah, I'm just a
You've
punching
just been
bag.
getting it left and right. My gosh. Okay, well, something else is on people's minds today. Mark Greenbaum in our audience asks, are we prepared if bird flu crosses over to humans and approaches pandemic levels?
A great question. And the fact is, in some respects, we're very well prepared, and in other respects, we're not. Because what we need to do more is to test the dairy workers to see if they are asymptomatically infected and transmitting it to others. They're not. We're lucky so far. There have been 3 cases, mild disease. 2 dairy workers only had conjunctivitis or inflammation, red eye, and 1 had that plus a little bit of a respiratory illness. Viruses like that have not yet adapted to transmissibility human to human. If you don't do the proper approach of proper testing, isolation, things like that, you can evolve a virus to adapt itself. So I don't think it's going to happen, but I hope we are more aggressive in our public health approaches to that. And most public health people feel the same way about that.
Audience member Sigal Klipstein asks, given that you have a longer view than almost anyone in your field, can you discuss your predictions for future pandemics and potential ways to mitigate or prevent them?
Yeah, a good question. So
we're asking you to pull out your crystal ball.
well, go before COVID, turn the clock back, and go from the time I started as the director of the Institute in 1984 and go up to, but not including COVID. I've got asked multiple times, Dr. Fauci, what keeps you up at night and what is your worst nightmare? And my consistent response was a brand new virus that jumps species from an animal reservoir to a human so that we've never been experiencing it before, that's respiratory borne, that has a high degree of transmissibility and is capable of a high degree of morbidity and mortality. And in January of 2020, my worst nightmare occurred, and that's what it. What is my worst nightmare now? A repeat of that. A respiratory virus that jumps from one species to another, that has a high degree of transmissibility. That's why the question about bird flu is very relevant. But what I worry about more than that is the encroachment on the animal-human interface. A not very well-known fact is that 75% or more of all the new infections were zoonotic, and zoonotic means they are in an animal reservoir, and they don't necessarily hurt the animal, but when they jump species, if they adapt themselves to human, you get a new disease. Let's have some cogent examples. HIV/AIDS, chimpanzee to human. Influenza pandemics, mostly from a bird or a pig where they jump species. Nipah virus, Ebola, all of those jump species. So one of the things we have to do is be careful about the encroachment on the animal-human interface. Like, for example, the first SARS was proven to be a bat to a civet cat, which was in a wet market where people come and buy these exotic animals. They get infected and then they spread it. We don't know how COVID started, but it is more likely it was that than a lab accident, even though we don't have any evidence for either. Well, we have more evidence for it being a natural occurrence, but we don't have definitive evidence, so it's still unclear. But most experienced virologists think it's much more likely that there was a jumping of species from an animal reservoir into a human in China, in Wuhan. Again, I keep an open mind because we don't know definitively how it happened.
You've talked quite a bit about how divided this country is, and still is today. On the flip side, I'm curious if you remember moments along this journey of yours where you saw society come together in some of the best ways, most productive ways.
Yeah, I mean, I'm old enough to know World War II.
Really?
Yeah, how about
Tell
that?
me about it.
Yeah, no, I was only 4 years old, but I didn't see much then except the sunlight in my little stroller.
But you remember being in your stroller in the warm sun. Okay.
In my stroller. No, I think a great example, I don't know if you say the country come together, but a phenomenal example of bipartisan work in my lane. My lane is medicine and science. You know, I don't have any expertise in other areas, and I try to stay in my lane. But back in 2000, the best drugs that was saving lives of people in the United States, Canada, the developed world, were the combination antiretroviral drugs that took HIV from an almost certain death sentence to, when given to people on a daily basis, first as multiple numbers of pills, now 1 pill a day, you can bring the level of virus to below detectable and keep it there so that people who are living with HIV can have essentially a normal life expectancy, maybe 2 or 3 years less. That was really phenomenal if you lived in the developed world. Back then, I felt very strongly that this disparity and inequity was almost, immoral, that people in sub-Saharan Africa or in certain Asian countries would die because they didn't have access to drugs. When I was taking care of patients in my post-traumatic stress days, all of my patients were dying because there were no drugs. Fast forward to the year 2000, when virtually anybody who had access to drugs in the United States were living essentially a normal life. But you go to Africa, and my colleagues, my African doctors that I knew that were my friends, they were having the same experience I was having in 1980s, 81, 82, 83, because their patients were dying because the drugs were not available.
Right.
So I decided that we needed to do something about that. And I was pushing to be able to have a program. Fortunately for me, for the rest of the world, particularly Africa, George W. Bush, a Republican president, brought me into the Oval Office and said, I feel strongly, this were his words, that that we, this country, has a moral obligation to not have people die of a preventable and treatable disease merely because where they happen to have been born, namely in the developing world.
Yeah.
So go to Africa, go to sub-Saharan Africa, and come back with a program that's transformative and that's accountable, that can really get rid of that disparity. And I did that. I did that in 2002.
Yeah. Incredible. Incredible.
But the critical issue is, I spent several months working with George W. Bush's people in the White House to put together a program which I said is going to cost a lot of money. And to his credit, he said, let me worry about the money, put the program together. So I made a proposal for $15 billion over 5 years to treat 2 million people, prevent 7 million infections, and care for 10 million people, including AIDS orphans. And we worked on that throughout the summer of 2002 in the fall. And to his great credit, President George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush, who actually announced it in the State of the Union address on January 28, 2003, the PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief. Fast forward 20 years, and in December of 2023, we had a dinner in Washington with President Bush and Laura and the team that helped put that together.
Nice.
And we looked at the numbers, and in December 2023, 20 years later, we had invested $110 billion for 50 countries as opposed to the original 14, and we had saved 25 million lives.
Wow. Wow.
That was an example of bipartisan support for a worthy program.
Yeah.
There was no ad hominems, there was no divisiveness. Everyone agreed under the leadership of a president of the United States that that's what should be done. And that, to me, is America at its finest, as opposed to what's going on now.
Sure is. Listen, Dr. Fauci, as we wind down, when we asked the audience for some questions, included in the batch were so many thank yous. Thank you for saving lives. Thank you for your service. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for all you've done for us. It's the same thing that President Biden said to you when you made that phone call and said you'd be stepping down. He said the same thing. He thanked you for your great work. You're 83. You write that you are still, to this day, filled with the passion and the energy and good health. You're not retiring anytime soon, are you?
Well, I just recently took a position at Georgetown University.
The man doesn't stop.
No, but at 83, I'm not going to be running any big clinical trials or doing the kind of experiments that I've done. But the one thing I can do, and that's the reason why I accepted the position at Georgetown, with a joint appointment in the School of Medicine and the School of Public Policy, because at my stage, what I think I have to offer, if I could inspire the students there, be they medical students or School of Foreign Service or the law school, to at least consider a career in public service, or if you don't want to do an official career in public service, maybe have part of what you do with your life public service. If I can do that for the next few years while I'm still able to stand up straight, that would be fine.
You're not running any more clinical trials, but you'll be running after your granddaughter, Lena.
I hope so.
Dr. Anthony Fauci, ladies and gentlemen, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.